The requirements of 30 years of total war, 30 years of war that involved an entire continent and required the marshalling of every resource of almost every major state in Europe, meant that Europeans not only began to look at different models of statecraft and different elements of diplomacy, but also drove them to consider different theoretical models and different practices that perhaps can address the sorts of issues that the 30 Years' War made clear. And one element that arose from this absolutism, one element that arose from this question was absolutism. The situation where a king can rule without restraint, without a parliament, without a government, without a different social class, without even religion, trying in fact to control the absolute power and authority of a monarch. Let's look at, first of all, the development of a theory of absolutism that justified why this would be a good thing. To us, it's unimaginable. But to the world that had seen the 30 Years' War, in fact, it seemed like a positive response, because at least a king who had no restraints could act quickly, who could protect the nation, who could ensure that this kind of terrible conflagration would never happen again. The wars of religion and the civil wars of the 16th and 17th centuries drove Europeans to seek different kinds of theoretical explanations for the disintegration of traditional society. They were looking for different kinds of remedies that would provide security and stability, that would answer some of the questions that were being raised by the disintegration of the verities that they had assumed to be universal and true. In France, the wars of religion, as we've seen, inspired the politique, those writers who wrote in favor of a central monarchy, who were willing to sacrifice the demands of religion in favor of a raison d'etat, in favor of a national policy that would put the public good and the national good above all other considerations, including those of religion. Well, not only France, but also England underwent a terrible civil war. England underwent that civil war of the 1640s that resulted in regicide, and it overthrew all of the assumptions about how the Crown and Parliament operated and what would arise from that once the power of the Crown had been humbled. During the period of the Civil War, many writers took up this issue, and of them, the most eloquent and the most effective spokesman for the theory of absolutism was Thomas Hobbes, an English thinker who was very close to the royalist side during the civil wars in the 1640s. He was close to the person of Charles I and an observer of the dangers involved in political division. But at the same time, Hobbes rejected Charles's own position. When Charles appeared before his court, he argued that he could not be judged by this court because he was a king and raised to that office by God alone. So he was responsible only to God. And this is the divine right of kings theory, where monarchs are absolute because God put them there, and so consequently they can respond only to the demands of God, not to the demands of their people. God determined what pair of sheets they would be born between, no one else did, and so the king then didn't need to pay attention to those beneath him because everybody was beneath him. The only person above him was God. However, Hobbes rejected this completely. Hobbes was looking for a secular concept of government. Hobbes was a materialist, and he wanted evidence of how government actually operated. And so he devised the concept of a contract between ruler and ruled that would govern the nature of political and social organization. And he put this together in his great book, The Leviathan, of 1651. Leviathan is, of course, the mythical monster in the biblical book of Job that presided over the universe. And to Hobbes, then, the state is a monster, but nevertheless, it is also a powerful monster. And indeed, it is omniscient and omnicompetent because this is the nature of government itself. Hobbes' famous response that every body, association, and corporation are but worms in the entrail of Leviathan really reflected his belief that the state must be omnicompetent because the state was above every agency within it and consequently included them all, but nevertheless they were all subject to it. Hobbes began his assessment of the nature of government by presuming a state of nature, that is, before government, before the institution of any rule of any kind. He then postulated that this state of nature was one of torment and misery, except, of course, for the very strongest, who would be able to take what they wanted from whom they wanted, when they wanted. Life in a state of nature, according famously to Hobbes, was solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. The remedy then was to build a society, was to create an organization for all where the law would operate equally for all members of that society, to establish then a government. And Hobbes put this in the context of his idea of contract. So he suggested that a contract or a bargain was struck, whereby the entire population agreed to yield all of their rights and powers to a ruler who would in return give them protection and government. But, he said, nothing remained to limit the power of the ruler, that the people had given all of their authority and rights to this ruler in exchange for protection and government and a law that was operative universally. He said that there were no laws of nature that restricted the power of the king, because nature has proved, in fact, to be brutal, nor any law of God, because Hobbes, remember, was a materialist. His famous statement that what is real is material, what is not material is not real, reflected his perspective. He also asked whether there is any evidence at any time that is verifiable of the intervention of God in human affairs. He said there is none, and so he's not going to discuss God at all. He's only going to talk about power and politics, which is in itself a revolutionary idea that takes the discussion of government and politics and social organization away from the attempt of justifying the ways of God to man, of attempting to move the desire to live according to some kind of divine plan from the organization of society and the practice of government, and then gives it its own realm, its own frame of reference, its own vocabulary. And with Hobbes, we really see the growth and the development, the idea of secular government, government that relies only on principles and ideals that are dependent upon the experience of human beings on earth. Absolute power, then, to Hobbes, was the gift of the people themselves. And it was a bargain, remember. The contract was signed, and once it was signed, you couldn't then revisit it. You can't say, well, that was then and this is now, because once that bargain is made, the people could not then seek redress because the contract was absolute and perpetual. Even if the ruler proved to be evil, and Hobbes said it was inevitable, you will get an evil or silly ruler, you could not rebel, because rebellion was unjust and it was suicidal, because the destruction of the central power of the crown would return the community to the brutal state of nature. This, of course, was his observation of the Civil War, and civil war is always more brutal than the most brutal and tyrannical king. Hobbes is also introducing another very, very famous element that we're going to see developed over the next series of lectures, and that is this contract theory. We're going to see in the next lecture how John Locke took it and then reached very different conclusions, and then ultimately, in the 18th century, how Jean-Jacques Rousseau took these ideas and then reached dramatically different conclusions in the contrat social, in the social contract. But Hobbes then was coming up with a theory, a justification for why it is that kings can rule without any kind of restraint. But now I think we have to look at this in practice. It's one thing to come up with a theory of politics, it's something else to see whether it actually works. And in order to do that, I think we should look at the France of Louis XIV and the events leading up to the creation of the royal absolutism of that monarch. France, in fact, perfected the principle of royal absolutism and manifested it most fully amongst the major powers of Europe, largely because it had developed over a period of time through the efforts of a number of extraordinarily remarkable individuals who forged royal absolutism in order to ensure that their masters would be able to achieve the policies that they recognized as most effective for their own kingdoms. we must go to the son of Henry IV, Louis XIII. Louis XIII was a child when his father was murdered, and he required a chief minister. And that chief minister ultimately was Cardinal Richelieu. We've already met Richelieu in the 30 Years' War and how he engaged in those remarkable heroics to save Protestantism from the zealously Catholic Habsburgs, despite the fact that Richelieu was a prince of the Roman Church. Richelieu was a truly remarkable individual, called a most subtle of a subtle race. And to take a moment just to illustrate how he became, in fact, a bishop and how he achieved his first level of power is, I think, instructive. His father had the advantage of being the provost of the royal household of Henry IV. And being a great aristocrat, he had a bishopric in his control, the bishopric of Luçon, and it was to go to young Armand, who was his son. Armand, though, was not old enough to be a bishop according to canon law, so it was necessary for him to have papal dispensation. Armand de Richelieu jumped on his horse and rode to Rome to see the Pope, Paul V Borghese. He then walked into the Pope's presence and he engaged in a brilliant, elegant Latin oration, saying that there has been a terrible mistake. He really is of canonical age. He's 25, and he should then become Bishop of Luçon because of his abilities and because of his learning. The Pope was impressed, and the Pope said, well, if you're 25 and you're clearly so learned, there's no question. So he allowed Richelieu to assume the position of Bishop of Luçon. As soon as he was invested with his see, Richelieu then went to the Pope, grabbed his knees, and said, "Forgive me, Father, for I have sinned. I've lied. I'm really only 21. The Pope giggled and said, "This man will go far, but will always be a rogue." It indicates Richelieu's not only brilliance, but also his determination. He's able to achieve great things because he is willing to break any law, to achieve great things because he's willing to sacrifice any right in order to accomplish what he thinks is best for France. His own interests are secondary. He really did believe that France was his essential goal. Richelieu identified for his master Louis XIII 3 essential policies that he needed to fulfill. One, he had to bring the Huguenots into full obedience to the crown. Generally, the reign of Henry IV had not only allowed the Huguenots, the French Calvinists, to become part of society, but it integrated them very much into the community. But nevertheless, there still were remnants. Around the fortified seaport of La Rochelle, there was almost a state within a state, with the Huguenots protecting their territory, fearing that perhaps there would be a change of policy. Richelieu, not permitting this, and also fearing that it could be a Trojan horse for France's enemies, laid siege to La Rochelle in 1628, and La Rochelle fell. But amazingly, what Richelieu did was not to destroy the Protestants. On the contrary, he reaffirmed their rights. He reconfirmed the Edict of Nantes. He allowed them to have their arms, and he ensured that they would have access to public office, and indeed even agreed to pay their pastors from the public purse. What we see then is that Richelieu was able to compromise the fundamental principles of even the religion he represented as a cardinal of the Roman Church for what he saw as the well-being of France. He turned potential enemies into loyal citizens, and he took these hardworking, educated, wonderfully constructive citizens and brought them back into French society. He also realized that he had to break the power of the nobility. This was really a remnant of feudalism in France. The great feudatories, the great names of France, still exercised violence and control in their territories, thinking that they were not answerable to anyone simply because of their patrimony. But Richelieu realized that this had to stop. First of all, because it was disruptive and created instability, and also because these were families that believed they were outside the power of the king. For centuries, the great feudatories had paid little attention to the power of the crown, and this had been made even worse by the terrible period of the wars of religion when central authority largely broke down. Richelieu realized that these times had passed and he had to stop it. And he knew, being one of them himself, exactly how to do it. He focused on their traditions. he passed a law forbidding dueling. To us, this is absurd, but why? Why dueling of all of the things that he could have done? Because dueling represented the violent traditions of the nobility. And dueling, we're not talking about two men back to back with revolvers. We're talking about pitched battles of private armies. As soon as he had forbidden dueling, in order to call his bluff, two young men, barely out of their teens, but representative of the greatest families in France, fought a duel under Richelieu's window, thumbing their nose. Richelieu watched them very calmly and noted exactly who was doing what. And as soon as the duel was over, as they giggled and went to the local bar, he had them arrested and publicly executed. It was a very effective way of getting the attention of the nobility by attacking the very principles of their independence, the idea of private justice. But Richelieu then had to do something about the power that the nobles had in the countryside, in particular the provinces. Feudalism had given them vast traditional authority in the areas around their estates. So Richelieu had to undo that. And so he created a new office, that of the intendant, the intendant. This figure was not a member of the great nobility, but of the lesser nobility or middle-class lawyers. They were the king's representatives. They answered to the king, and their power came only from the authority that the crown gave them. And it was their responsibility to enact the king's laws, to collect taxes. And it was enormously successful. The amount of tax actually collected increased, and the level of justice improved. Moreover, he had established something. He had begun the bureaucratic professionalization and centralization of power that is necessary for absolutism. Unless the king knew that he had a vehicle to make his will known and to deliver, then the theory of absolutism could have no reality. The office of the intendant, among others, allowed then the king to have his will felt in every corner of the kingdom. His third policy was to make France a leading power in the continent, and that meant breaking the encirclement by Habsburg states, the Kingdom of Spain, the Empire, and the attempt to recover the Dutch lands to the north. So he provided money to the Protestants, as we've seen, to fight against the Catholics in the 30 Years' War. It led to victory over Spain, in the process bankrupting the Spanish crown. And by 1643, Richelieu has succeeded in making France the most powerful kingdom in all of Europe. And he also made his master, Louis XIII, essentially absolute, both within and without France. To do this, he was ruthless. His taxation policies were confiscatory. He violated the rights of all the subjects, regardless of their rank, from the greatest aristocrat to the poorest of peasants. He took his lead from the Protestants, and he established spies and informers everywhere. But rather than, as in Geneva, bringing them before the consistory to be excommunicated or chastised, he issued a lettre de cachet, a document that had them thrown in prison at the king's will. The king, of course, often had a short memory, and they were forgotten for years. Richelieu, then, was a most remarkable man. But we also have to look at the other part of his personality and remember that it was he who founded and established the Académie Française in 1635. He was a very cultivated man who also saw the glory of France to be the glory of its culture. When he lay dying, his confessor asked him whether he had forgiven his enemies. Richelieu looked and said, "But I have no enemies." Everybody around said, "But Your Excellency, Monseigneur, everybody hates you." He said, "I have no enemies. My enemies are the enemies of France." And he truly believed it. He, in fact, succeeded in making France a secure kingdom, establishing defensible borders, created an absolute monarchy by ensuring that the king would be able to actually have his will felt, and he established a platform on which the young son of Louis XIII would be able to build. And that, of course, is Louis XIV. Louis XIII and Cardinal Richelieu died within months of one another in 1643, and the throne was left to the 5-year-old Louis XIV. He, of course, had to have a regency because of his youth, and that regency was dominated by another cardinal, Richelieu's favorite, this time an Italian, but one who Gallicized his name, Jules Mazarin. The death of Richelieu, moreover, resulted in renewed civil wars, known as the Fronde. In French, fronde means slingshot, and it takes its name from the breaking of all of the windows in the Palais Royal, which was Richelieu's palace, by the rioters spurred on by the Parlement of Paris. A parlement in France is not a parliament, it's actually a senior law court. All of these forces, like the Parlement, were hostile to Richelieu's centralization. And in particular, the Parlement of Paris hoped to follow the example, the model of the English Parliament to humble the monarchy. Equally, the great nobles thought this was their opportunity. With Richelieu dead and the king a child, they would be able then to reassert their power in the locality and return to their factional violence. But Mazarin succeeded with great difficulty in keeping France together until his death in 1661. He too sustained the privileges of the Huguenots. He confirmed again the Edict of Nantes, that remarkable document guaranteeing the toleration of Calvinists, now more than 70 years old. And when he was dying in 1661, Mazarin gave the young Louis XIV advice very different from the advice that Richelieu had left in his political testament for Louis XIII. The advice of Mazarin was that Louis XIV should not take a new first minister, that he should assume that responsibility himself. And in 1661, Louis XIV thought this good advice and accepted it. And so from that time on, the French monarchy became truly absolute, because the king was not only the source of sovereignty, he also was its executive officer. Mazarin's death then ended a period of great first ministers, and entered a new period, a period, in fact, in which the crown was absolute in every way. Mazarin, too, had another side. He was very different from Richelieu. He wasn't a workaholic like Richelieu. He wasn't a hypochondriac like Richelieu. And he was altogether too fond of his nieces, who received a good deal of the king's treasury. He was also one of the great art collectors of history, and somebody who truly appreciated art. And the circumstances of his last moments, as he lay dying, he had his servants carry him around his palace so he could say farewell to each one of his beloved pictures individually. A man you can't help but appreciate. Louis XIV then had become his own chief minister. He was the king in every way. But no one man could rule a country as large and as complex as France without loyal servants. And Louis XIV was blessed in having one of the most talented bureaucrats ever to have lived as his really minister of all things. He collected offices one on top of another until essentially he ran much of the bureaucracy. And that was Jean-Baptiste Colbert. Under Colbert's administrative genius, glory, style, victory, wealth seemed to reside in France at the court of the Sun King, Le Roi Soleil, Louis XIV. And Colbert was nothing short of an administrative genius who transformed the French economy by protecting manufacturing and agriculture, by strengthening the navy and the merchant fleets and supporting colonial expansion so that France would be able to compete with the English and the Dutch. He found money for not only the King's Wars of Glory, but also for the enormous palace at Versailles, which began in 1668. The Palace of Versailles was not just the monster house of a monster ego. It was a symbol of royal absolutism. It was a vehicle for the control of the nobility, and it was a theater in which royal absolutism could be acted out. In fact, the English observer Lord Bolingbroke remarked that if Louis XIV was not the greatest king who ever lived, he was certainly the greatest actor of majesty. And Versailles was the place where the action happened. This great structure required the nobility to live at this palace and become, in effect, the lapdogs of the king. They were cut off from their power in the countryside, and because the king was absolute, they had to ask the king himself whether they were to get monopolies or whether they were to get commissions in the army or whether they were to get favors of any kind. And so Versailles then was not just a place to indicate the conspicuous consumption of Louis XIV, it was an instrument of policy. The one great failure of Colbert, and one that was ultimately to bring down the French crown itself, was his inability to reform French taxation. The poor pay too much and the richest pay nothing at all. And this system always destroys the nation that refuses to recognize that those who have gained the greatest benefit really deserved to make the greatest sacrifices. And as we'll see with the bankruptcy of the French crown and the Revolution, that this was Colbert's greatest failure. This period of Louis XIV's reign then, the period where Colbert was his minister of everything and where the king himself was a man of great gifts and great intelligence, really ended with the death of Colbert and, in the same year, Louis's first wife, Marie-Thérèse of Austria, in 1683. It was a period of French ascendancy, where not only French arms, but French style, the French language, French culture began to dominate the entire continent, and France was seen as the place where all great things would happen. And indeed, the French were winning great victories in battle. The monarchy was celebrated. Louis was recognized as Louis le Grand, the Sun King, the image of Louis as Apollo, the image of Louis as Mars, the god of war, appeared not only in the Palace of Versailles, but everywhere that you looked, and people believed it. However, the second half of his reign was far less glorious, and indeed reflects the dangers of absolutism and the period that Louis presided over in the last decades of his life, in fact, led to a set of circumstances that ultimately would help destroy the French monarchy. Even before the death of Colbert, the overly regulated mercantilist system that he had created began to strangle French trade to some extent, but Colbert was able to manage it. But the wars that Louis would not stop fighting drained French finances and emptied the treasury. Colbert was able to find more money, but his successors could not. Moreover, the peasantry suffered the most. They suffered not just from confiscatory taxation, but forced recruitment in the army, from famine, from disease. Louis lost a generation of young men in his wars, and he lost his best servants and generals to battle and old age. By 1697, the situation fiscally in France had become desperate. By 1697, the expenditures of the French crown on war were almost twice the total revenue of the crown. Nevertheless, Louis continued his aggressive and ambitious foreign policy in order to ensure that France would always be the most powerful and the most elegant kingdom on the entire European continent. Even in the face of an overwhelming alliance, he, in the last decades of his reign, would go to war to ensure the dynastic glory of his house. His grandson, Philippe d'Anjou, would become King of Spain. The last Habsburg king had died without an heir, and although all of Europe tried to prevent it, the Treaty of Utrecht in 1714 allowed Philippe d'Anjou to become Philip of Spain and the direct ancestor of the current Spanish king. But the greatest failure that I think we can identify in all of Louis's reign was a failure that resulted from a memory of a Europe that we had hoped had passed. He revoked the Edict of Nantes, 100 years after it was promulgated by Henry IV. Why did he do such a foolish thing? He was an old man and very ill. His son and grandson had died before him. He was obsessed with a late piety, and also he had married his last mistress as a morganatic wife, Madame de Maintenon, who required a Catholic kingdom. So Louis revoked the Edict of Nantes and required Catholicism for all of his subjects. And the result was 200,000 Huguenots, 200,000 Huguenots left France in order to enrich the culture and the economies of France's enemies. They went to Holland, to Germany, to England, to South Africa, and to the British colonies in America, where the descendants live to this day. So how can we judge this policy of Louis XIV, and how can we judge the rule of absolutism that he represented? To some extent, it represents exactly the advantages and problems of absolutism. Hobbes was right. It provided a united kingdom, and it provided quick action, centralization. It mobilized all of the resources of a nation, especially in times of war. But there is no restraint. There is not even good counsel, and people are afraid to offer advice the king does not want to hear. As long as he's guided by clever men like Richelieu or Mazarin or Colbert, things perhaps might have turned out differently. But once his personal rule was without restraint and without advice, the kind of vanity and the kind of megalomaniacal ambition that characterized the last years of Louis XIV's reign destroyed his kingdom as well as his own reputation. The Kingdom of France suffered greatly in those last years, but nevertheless, as we began with Hobbes, we will end with Louis XIV. Both the theory and practice of absolutism have their advantages, and especially in the confused and unstable context of Europe of the 17th century. But ultimately, the seeds of destruction are apparent in any absolute system, because ultimately the idea of rights, of human rights, which we'll see developed in the work of John Locke in the next lecture, when we see the rise of a set of principles based upon observable proof, based upon concepts that human rights cannot be taken away for the advantage of the king or even raison d'etat, then we'll see a challenge to absolutism that would give rise, first of all, to enlightened concepts of government and eventually to the revolution in France itself.